Welcome to Endless, a Sandman podcast from Chipperish Media. I'm writer, erstwhile DC Comics editor, and humanitarian wit gourmet and international traveler, Alisa Whitney.
And I'm story expert and something bad on the way, Lani Diane Rich. Today on Endless, we're going to be talking about Sandman, Volume 5, A Game of You, Chapter 2, Lullabies of Broadway.
A Game of You, Chapter 2, Lullabies of Broadway, was written by Neil Gaiman, drawn by Sean McManus, colored by Daniel Vazzo, and lettered by Todd Klein. This issue was edited by Karen Berger, assisted by Alisa Whitney. Cover by Dave McKean.
All asleep. They're all asleep. Everybody is all asleep. Time to wake up. In A Game of You, Chapter 2, Lullabies of Broadway, Barbie wakes up after a rough night to a knock on the door. It's her neighbor, Hazel, who has a question about what to do if you think you might be pregnant. As a lesbian, this isn't something Hazel's had to think about that much, but a late night with a coworker led to accidental sex on Hazel's part, and now her period's late. After giving Hazel advice, Barbie sits down to watch TV and falls asleep, where she's visited by the fairy Nuala, who warns her that bad things are on the way. Barbie wakes up, then drifts off again to dream of her ex, Ken, mocking her new life. Meanwhile, in his apartment, George of the Order of the Cuckoo slices open his chest and releases the birds he consumed earlier, and they go to visit the dreamers of the building. Wanda's having a nice dream of being given beautiful free dresses as the kids who bullied her when she was young express how happy they are for her now. Then a bird lands on her shoulder, and her dreams turn to a surgery she's terrified of being forced on her by weirdos. Hazel dreams of traveling by train, but being unsure of where she's going or whether she speaks the language or if she even has her ticket. She is forced into a cellar where she finds her baby dead for 70 years. She brings it home to sleep with Foxglove's live baby, and Hazel's baby eats it alive, then comes after them. Foxglove dreams of Judy, her ex, who died in a massacre at a diner, and remembers Fox as Donna, her ex-girlfriend. Judy blames Fox for her death and asks about Hazel. In her room, Thessaly wakes up when one of George's birds lands on her. She calls it a nasty little thing, then smashes it against the wall and it burns up in her hands. She puts on her glasses and goes to George's apartment, holding a knife behind her back. Meanwhile, Barbie's dreams have finally gotten her to the land, and she has to deliver the bad news of Martin Tenbone's demise to Luz, Prinadoo, and Wilkinson. Luz loses hope, but Prinadoo and Wilkinson insist that the princess can still help. She has the porpentine, after all. She asks where the brightly shining sea is. Of course, it's a long way off. Well, she says, then we'd better get going. All right, Alisa, so here we are talking about A Game of You, issue number 2. What do you think? What's your overall response to this one?
Okay, first, a very specific response. No one listening to this will know, because it will be edited, how much trouble we had with the pronunciation of these names, where you say it in your head. I haven't listened to the Audible, and I thought it was Prinadoo, kind of like Xanadu,
right.
But now I don't know.
We've said it so many times, so many different ways.
So many times. And then just the phrase loses hope
right.
is just a tongue twister. But aside from that, lately I've been having a little trouble falling asleep, and I've been thinking how when sometimes your subconscious is not your best friend. Sometimes, you spend your day focused on tasks, maybe also, working on yourself, all these things. But then you lie down and your subconscious says, let's go time traveling into uncomfortable regions. And I thought how well this captures that trepidation. There are other issues of the Sandman where we've talked about people's dreams, but this captured some of that discomfort. And I loved how it was psychological, but on the other hand, there was also this nice aspect of world building. We've touched upon this a little, that some areas of the dreaming are more solid than others.
Yeah.
So, these areas like the area in the dreaming where Barbie's oh God, what's the word for an island? It's not an island.
Oh,
it's
the scaries.
It's a scary.
It's a
Thank
scary.
you. It's an SK.
Yes.
It's an SKERRY. Scary.
But what's more appropriate though for Sandman and Dreaming than calling the island scary?
A scary. Yeah, it is. It is. But the idea that some of these geographical areas are more built up and others are much more ephemeral. So the very personal dreams are, that is not an area of the dreaming that's built up and solid relative to Barbie's dream. So I thought that was a great bit of world building. And what about you? What did you think?
Okay, well, I'm stuck on this last brilliant thing that you said. This idea that the very personal things, the things that are bespoke, the dream situations that are bespoke to us and our very specific experience are not as well built, because every time somebody goes to a place in the dreaming, it builds it up. Right? It must be something that just builds it up and makes it more solid. So the most visited spaces are the ones that are built up the most. I really love that. And to the point where the land itself has become something that is completely built up. I also love this idea too of the dreaming as sort of a rotation of play sets, right? It's all the stage of the dreaming, right? But the sets will change based on whatever it is that particular person needs from their dreams. And then here we have these birds coming in and taking dreams that some of them were not dark to begin with, but got real dark once the birds landed on their shoulders. So I thought that was really interesting. But overall, I have to say, this is a nice issue. I really feel like a story is moving forward. We've got Barbie back into her dreams, into the land. And this wonderful note of Thessaly being ready to fight back against George and the Order of the Cuckoo. I really kind of love the way all of this, it's reminiscent of the dream space that was happening in Doll's House, right? Except we don't have, a vortex breaking down the walls between the dreams. So that's not the threat. But that these birds go out, and George's, chest being a bird cage, I love that. And they all go flying out to cause all sort of havoc. And the purpose of that and all of that, like, I think a lot of those questions are naturally unanswered at this early stage of the story. And, some of them might not ever get answered, which is part of the fun too. But I feel like we're in a solid space. Like, I feel like I'm being led through a very deliberate story by someone who knows exactly where we're going. And I really kind of love that. So yeah, I'm in, I'm enjoying it.
I'm glad. The other thing, we're about to talk a bit about the cover art and Dave McKean. And when this first came out, I remember thinking that Thessaly in looks reminded me a bit of Dave's partner, Claire. So Claire is this lovely, she's not as librarianish. She's sort of more of a kind of earthy, hippie earth goddess chick, but she still has this wonderful long brown hair and this face that's just so innocent looking, and and she has actually a deliciously naughty sense of humor. So I remember initially thinking that Thessaly had, in appearance, a little bit of Claire McKean.
Oh, that's so
Claire
nice.
Haythorne-Thwaite, actually.
That's really, it's neat to kind of get that little like background stuff in there. And it's one of the many wonderful things that you bring to this podcast. But the cover itself, the cover is again broken into two jagged color spaces. We have a cool blue title that says A Game of You at the top. And then below in warm reds and oranges, we have this collaged vision of George with his chest open, rib cage showing, birds flying out. Behind him, we see a shadow or his shadow. The shadow does feel sort of like it's got its own personality and intent, right? On the wall, it is facing away from him on one side, and I find that really interesting. And then we've got a bunch of framed pictures on the wall to the other side. It is super creepy and evocative and wonderful, and I love Dave McKean's work on this. It is not... it is always pulled from the story, but it always seems to pull rather than the literal movements of the story, like the feel of the story and the subtext of the story, which I absolutely love about that work.
Yeah, and I think that if there are people, like myself, who aren't as comfortable with contemporary art as they are with more traditional looking art. So, there are many of us who can see a beautiful and fairly realistic rendering of a person or a landscape and relate to it. But Dave is a great introduction to more conceptual kinds of art, because here you can see what the relationship is to the themes and the mood and the vibe of the piece without having it be so literal, with seeing it transformed through this other way of seeing.
Yeah, it just provides a different perspective, especially once you've read the issue. You go back and you look at, Dave McKean's cover is great. It's the first thing you see, but you really should follow up every issue with looking back at the cover and then seeing what you didn't notice before because you didn't realize that it was narratively significant, and then these little things will pull in and it gives you kind of this sort of a rounding out of an understanding of what that particular story was about.
And it's making me think how a lot of writers, Jenny Cruzy was the first writer I knew who did it, use collage as a way into a story. And I had this problem that I was just so absurdly literal. So I remember at that time I had magazines and I tried doing it, and it just looked like some serial killer had gotten a hold of some models and I don't know what I'd done with them. It was very bad. But one of my goals right now is to learn more about image transfer and to be able to do more collage so I can start from a Dave McKean place and find my story in there.
Oh, yeah.
Just as, we're talking about doing the episode.
Yeah. No, using collage as a way into a story is this incredibly valuable thing that Jenny taught me how to do. And I resisted it every single time. Like I was always like, I don't want to do this because it's not my thing. Like I'm not a visual storyteller. Like I really struggle to get that access to that, which is why that is the most important thing for me to do. That is the most important, exercise for me to do as a writer. And the thing about collage is that you can take elements from, like the classic, you cut out, images from magazines, or you take stuff off the internet and then print it out and then stick it on a physical collage, or you can do it digitally in like Photoshop or whatever. There's a million ways to collage. You can make a Pinterest board if that's your thing. But the thing that it does so wonderfully is that it really does connect you as a writer to the visual space of the story, but also it ends up like bringing out so much, like in the discovery phase, so much from the story that you hadn't anticipated, but because you ran across something random in your search for other things, those elements will come in and they'll mean something, and Dave's ability to take collage and take these elements and give us things like a shadow on the wall, right? But it's a shadow on the wall that looks to me like it has its own sentience, it has its own agency, it has its own objective, right? Which could be different from what George's objective is. Or it could be the paranoid part of George that is constantly looking over his own shoulder, making sure that stuff isn't coming for him. Like, who knows? I may have a better theory for that as we move on in the story. But that artwork and the ability and power of that artwork to not just show us setting and like visual elements, but to really use those visual elements to give us a sense of the feel of the story. Stories are always about how it feels, not what it is, right? And so the way that McKean's art does that so beautifully for these issues, while not drawing on the literal art style of the interior art, while doing something different, I think is just a level of genius that I just really want like an entire art gallery that is nothing but like Dave McKean covers and, little explanations and behind the scenes and all that kind of stuff, which from the Dave McKean book that I got, because I really want to see the covers not on the Kindle that I use to read these. It's so incredibly beautiful and evocative and interesting. And the more you look at it, the more you find. And I think that honestly is probably about the most you could possibly ask from a cover artist. To get somebody like Dave McKean is an incredible blessing. I'm sure what you felt when you were editing.
Yes. Yeah. And you've also got, you picked up on this theme of shadow selves, which I think you're definitely going to see more of in the issues. Now I have something to talk about that is, I always space out on how to say Josh's name.
Unruh.
Unruh.
Joshua Unruh. Yes.
So I have an Unruh kind of moment here that I want to talk about, which is Weirdo Wanda.
Yes, I want to hear all about that.
Okay, so the Weirdzos are a take on Bizarros. So Bizarros were from old Superman and Action Comics. And in the twisted logic of the Bizarro world, everything is opposite, but it's kind of delivered with this ruthless, naive enthusiasm. And I love that Neil was such a reader of these old comics that he picked up on that and wanted to incorporate it into the world building. So you've got, obviously stuff that's deeply psychological, and then you've also got these, treasure troves of old comic stuff. However, the Sandman people said, Neil, not to use the Weirdo and Superman. And so
the
it got
Bizarro
changed to
and Superman.
Hyperman. Yeah, sorry, not to use the Bizarro and Superman, so it became Weirdo and Hyperman. Prinadu. Clearly, sorry. So anyway, in that dream sequence with Wanda, Samuel Delaney, who goes by Chip, so Chip Delaney took it as meaning that Wanda was perhaps ambivalent about her identity. But Neil has said later in the annotated Sandman or in the Sandman Companion with High Bender, I can't remember which, that, he meant it to be based on this friend of a friend. And it was an ambivalence about the surgery, about vaginoplasty, as opposed to, a conflict about
the actual identity. That's absolutely
the
how I
actual
read
identity.
It. I read it as a a fear of the surgery itself, and having that surgery forced upon her, when that needs to be her choice. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, for what it's worth, that's how I took it. I didn't take it as, I don't take Wanda as being ambivalent about her identity at all.
I don't think, and again, the classic close reading, which a lot of us learned in school,
yes,
in high school or in college, has to do with only viewing the text and not talking at all about authorial intention, and that all our interpretations that are textually based are valid. But in this case, I do think, I am not a religious close reader. And so I think it is useful to know, but I think that it is, talking to people, I've gotten the sense that this whole question of sexual identity and surgery has become, deeply divisive and political. And I like that this, just for me, this individual character having, her own fears, which again, I never took it as being rooted in ambivalence about who she was to herself. But, I even think ambivalence has got to be okay too. The weird thing is, I've always felt myself to be female, and yet I've had some ambivalence about it over the years. Maybe we even demonize ambivalence. I don't know.
We absolutely do. I think that we are living through a time period that is extremely unstable, and one of the things that people want to go back to and actually have this almost exact discussion coming later, so I'll save a lot of that for later on as we discuss something else. But I think that people are very much attracted to a simplistic view of the world in which, things are black or white. They're in this binary. We're really, really reaching toward the binary. And I'm not talking about like gender binary. I'm talking about binary and everything, like good and bad and, all of that kind of stuff. That when something is one thing, it is not allowed to be any other thing, and someone who is going through the trans experience, because I think, and this is from my perspective outside of that experience, so please, I will take all corrections, Lani at LaniDineRich.com. But I think that when somebody who is, visibly trans has any ambivalence about that experience, that it can feel like it's a statement about, whether trans people are real, or whether they are women, or whether they are men, or whether they're non-binary, or whatever. Because there is such a tendency culturally for the attack to come in, to be like, oh, you're not really feeling that, and questioning all of that, so that the space for an individual character or person to question all of those things and to have moments of uncertainty feels like that's not available. But that uncertainty is such an incredibly human experience, and taking that away from anybody, I think, is a tragedy. So I would say that I think that because of the ways in which so much in our society, like, you're liberal, like, I'm very liberal and progressive in my politics. Everybody, I will pause for your shocked expressions and gasps, right? But if there is anything in which, like, I don't, like, agree 100% with any particular, like, side of the usually, if I disagree with, like, the Democrats, it's because I'm further left usually. But I mean, the point is, like, you can't disagree with the side that you have been identified and associated with, and you can't think critically and all of that kind of stuff. So in a world in which we need desperately to be thinking more critically, that critical thinking, the reaction to that critical thinking, the reaction to even questioning, the side with which you are associated, becomes something that I think makes us feel further destabilized. All of this philosophy that I'm spouting right now, off the top of my head, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. So I just would like that to be, like, a disclaimer as I say this. This is all kind of theoretically what I've been thinking about lately. And I think that creating space here where Wanda is allowed to be a woman, in that space, and also have some ambivalence about everything that is expected of a trans woman to do with her body, which, by the way, anything that any woman or any person does with their body is their damn business. Just saying that. But so I feel like some of that response can be that feeling. But I like that we have that space for that fear and that ambivalence. I mean, good God, if you were doing anything with your body that was going to change it, you have to go through a process. There has to be space for a process for you to really think about it and really know that's what, I mean, fuck's sake, I struggle to get a tattoo, I mean, I want a tattoo. I love tattoos, but every time I think about it, that commitment is a bit much. Yes.
Okay, wait. I have to. So I just found out there's this thing called ephemeral tattoos.
No, yes, we talked about that, I think, a couple of times ago when I was talking about how I'm ambivalent about the tattoo. Yeah.
So I started to think about, maybe I would do a tattoo with completely biodegradable ink that would, just fade away. I like that because God only knows nothing is permanent, in this life, including, the placement of one's breasts.
Yes.
So anyway.
I love that.
Speaking of things that change the placement of one's breasts. You like my segue?
That was brilliant. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I want to talk about Hazel's pregnancy and her and the dream about the pregnancy. So I remember I was, brushing up on my reading about the issue. So Chip Delaney also had a question about Hazel's level of ignorance about her own biology. And his feeling was someone living in a Lower East Side, tenement would be more savvy. And I remember at the time, so when this came out, I was, 21 or 22. And I also thought, would she really not know that much about pregnancy? Interestingly enough, this was based on a real person who was a lesbian who was living in metropolitan London and who asked Neil these very questions about pregnancy.
Yeah.
So I think, it is so often the case that the things that we might find least plausible in fiction are things that are actually based on reality.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing that I keep telling everybody is that fiction is not answerable to reality, right? So you cannot say, oh, but that really happened and make it suddenly believable, because unbelievable things happen every freaking day. But you also can't say, oh, that's not believable in the fiction, so it doesn't, you know what I'm saying? Like you have to understand that fiction is not answerable to reality. It is answerable to what it means. It's answerable to meaning, right? And so I think that I also was like, just because Hazel's a lesbian doesn't mean that she didn't take basic, sex education. Although it's possible, depending on where she grew up, that she might not have gotten that. Like, that's definitely possible. But
it didn't feel the need to, interrogate it further because she is a lesbian.
Sure. Like, it's something that you think doesn't apply to you because you're not going to have to deal with that. And then a situation comes up and these things happen. So I think that I was a little bit like, well, that doesn't really ring true to me. But at the same time, I was like, let's make some space for this is the situation with Hazel and Barbie having this conversation. I'm still not exactly sure what narratively that conversation was doing, aside from establishing that Hazel was fearing that she was pregnant. So when she goes into this dream, but either way, I'm leaving it open that it has a narrative significance that will come in later. And if it doesn't, oh well, it was still like an interesting conversation for Barbie and Hazel. But I think I side kind of with Chip. Like, fiction is not answerable to reality. Just because it really happened that way doesn't necessarily mean that it fits in the story. But and we're not done with the story yet, so who knows?
And I think if we had more context about Hazel and how she was raised and what her life experience was, I have to say, the older I get, the more I realize that we all have these weird pockets of ignorance that probably should have been, handled when we were in middle school or high school. And, just your life takes you in certain directions. I mean, I remember being in my 20s and I'd learned to drive. But because I'd grown up on the Upper West Side, I'd never pumped gas. And I was just confused and intimidated by trying to figure out where I pulled up the car, where the gas. It's just, you don't think of it. If you've grown up in driving culture, it just seems natural. But I needed an explicit lesson in how to fill my gas tank. Which, when you think about it, is a bit like pregnancy.
A lot like pregnancy. Pregnancy is one of those things that happens to you and then you're just like, okay, guess we're doing this now, Even when you're trying to get pregnant. Like, there's a difference between the trying to get pregnant part and then when it happens and you're like, oh, wait, we can put on the brakes now. Especially my personal experience was okay, now I have to give birth, because prior to that, I was just thinking about getting pregnant and then having a baby that I could, dress up and do all the fun stuff with and raise and all that. But then when you're actually going to go through it, that's when you're like, okay, wait a minute, how does this work? And what is this going to what's going to happen here? And the internet was not available the way that it is now. So you're not able to get information like that. And you have to go to your friends and hope that they are knowledgeable. All of that said, what it comes down to for me always is, how is this serving the narrative? I will absolutely make space for Hazel having been homeschooled by very religious parents and then gone into a world where she was separated from all of that and just never got the education that she needed to have because she was lesbian. So I'm not going to have to worry about this. I'm not going to use my brain space for it. I can definitely see that, but what that conversation did narratively, I don't know yet, but I'm definitely open to it.
And I really also want to point this. I forgot to put this in my notes, but I loved Barbie's casual mention of an abortion, which was one of the things that I have noticed, and I think it's just begun to change a little, is that even back in the times when, many, many years when Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, no one in a book, a TV show, or a movie could get pregnant and decide to have an abortion. If they did decide, in the end, they would change their mind or have a miscarriage.
Or be racked with regret and guilt. Yeah, that was the only narrative we were allowed around abortion.
or abortion is okay, but not for me. So you didn't really have any role models of someone taking a moment, thinking it over, and deciding this isn't right for me right now.
Yeah.
And I think that it's in big ways and in little ways, when we don't see people like us reflected in fiction, it impacts, especially when we're younger, how we make our choices.
Absolutely it does. And which is why representation is so very important in like every aspect, from the choices that we make to the identities that we hold. And not just having representation, but like that people who've had those experiences being willing to talk about them. The women who came out and said, I had my abortion, I don't regret it, this is what happened. That sharing of those stories, those personal stories, is so incredibly powerful. And as the media in general deeply, deeply failed us in that regard during the entire time that Roe was available, the same way the politicians failed us by not codifying it into law. That's a whole other discussion.
That is.
But the thing is, I do really love that it is a non-judgmental discussion of that as an option. And it's just like kind of laid out there. I think that is a wonderful bit of representation to have available, to readers of this comic.
Yeah, and it shows us in a way that Barbie is not exactly who she appears, even at the beginning of this story, and even in her, vintage Letterman-esque dream of Ken just humiliating her, calling her boring.
Oh, how dare he? How dare he? Ken doesn't even have genitals. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about Thessaly.
So Thessaly is really interesting to me. She's a character I've loved, but not admired. And I mean, I think it is interesting. There's a lot, I think, of talk on Twitter that I see about her being a TERF, and we'll look into that later. I don't want to do any spoilers, but I still think that there is an interesting element. I think John Constantine in the comics never strikes people as someone to be admired.
Right.
He is a ruthless and at very best morally gray character. And I don't think we extend that same understanding to female characters. They're meant to be heroines or villainesses, and we don't necessarily look to them in that gray area. So I'll have more to say about Thessaly in Lucien's library, and I guess we will certainly be talking more about her as the series goes on. But I think, to me, it is a misreading to only look to Thessaly to be a good or an evil character.
Absolutely. And that is definitely something I've got, like I said, lots of notes on that particular binary in fiction for when we have that discussion in Lucien's library. Right now, it's interesting because I don't have any other context about Thessaly. I have not read the whole thing. I have kind of kept out of the discourse about it. I really want to come into this, as clear as I can. And right now, I like Thessaly. I like the fact that she's awake. I like the fact that she smashes the bird. It's a bit violent, but okay. If the bird is doing evil, then fair enough. I'm interested. Right now, I'm very interested in what I don't know about Thessaly. But the fact that she is not apparently susceptible to this manipulation the way that the others in the house are, I find really interesting. And that was kind of one of the things that I was thinking about is here we have this house of dreams and we have all of these things happening. We have Hazel's, baby eating foxglove's baby, which I thought was really interesting. One of the things that
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I forgot to mention, that was actually based on a real dream of Neil's. I think that may be one of the few Sandman dreams that really is based on a nightmare that he had.
I love that. Well, I mean, the thing is, one of the things that, a concept that I ran across some years ago and have always kind of been really, really interested in is this idea that every relationship becomes a third entity, that like you are you and they are them, and your relationship together is a third thing, you know? So I really actually kind of enjoyed the two babies, as that there's Hazel's baby, which is her part of her vision of that relationship baby that they are together. And Foxglove's is very healthy. Hazel's got this secret, so this baby is dead and zombified and now eating everything and ruining everything. I found that to be like kind of really interesting on that sort of subtextual, you know, level, and really enjoyed that. I mean, it was a disturbing dream. But I liked the metaphor of it. I don't know if that was what was intended, but again, that's just my reading of it. And Foxglove receiving a visit from Judy. We find out that Foxglove was formerly Donna, and had reinvented herself and come out here. And then here is the dead Judy coming out saying that her death is Foxglove's fault. I thought that was really interesting. Also super dark, also bird, influenced, I believe. But it was neat to kind of see that connection. Like we had Rose connected to Judy. Now we have Foxglove connected to Judy, and the world building is all kind of interconnected. And we see these little, characters waving at each other as they go by. I like what that does to like the stitching of the fabric of the universe that these stories are being told within, that there's all of that connection. There's all, like, in the early parts of this podcast, I remember talking about like Neil using every part of the pig, that like he would go into all the DC lore and the DC universe and pull in the old Sandman and like, all these characters and kind of like feed the Martian, and kind of feed them into this universe. And it strengthens the feeling of the whole universe. Like if you lean against the walls in this universe, they will be solid, And I really, really like that. And I thought that was interesting. What did you think about this revelation that Foxglove was formerly, Judy's girlfriend from 24 Hours?
I think that all of that, as you say, it makes you feel that this is a world in, I don't know, it doesn't feel like such a close connection that it's all, too tight and too small a world, but it feels like we are getting to snake along all these strands of the web and pick up these other connections. Because, I mean, one thing we know about Judy's relationship with Foxglove, who was once Donna, is that she was abusive to her. She was physically, violent with her. And it also gives this lovely perspective on how we are different people in different relationships. So with Judy and Donna, there was clearly this passionate relationship in which Donna was the weaker. She's renamed herself. She's reinvented herself. And if you look at the dynamic with Hazel, you can see it's a very different romantic dynamic. My mother used to say every relationship is a reaction, and sometimes an overreaction to the relationship that went before. And especially in this storyline, which is so much about the reinvention of self. I mean, we have so many characters here going through reinventions. We have Foxglove, who's renamed herself. We have Barbie, who is, going through her own identity crisis. Obviously, Wanda has reinvented herself so that she is more in keeping with her true internal selfhood and not the identity that was assigned to her. And then, of course, we have Thessaly. There's so little that I can say about Thessaly. I have all these things for our next episode about her provenance, shall I say, but I just don't want to get ahead.
Well, that's okay. We don't have to get ahead. But let's talk a little bit about Barbie, right? Because this is, ostensibly Barbie's story. But I feel like we're getting a similar kind of situation that we had with Rose in Doll's House, especially in the beginning, is that all the other stuff going on is so interesting. And then we have Barbie, who is supposed to be kind of like the protagonist of the piece, right? And we're really not even saying that much about her. But here we have her, up in the morning, she's counseling Hazel, but of course Hazel's situation then as someone who, had sex with somebody that she was deeply seemed to be ambivalent about, and now is wrestling with this, potential pregnancy, that there's a lot more narrative weight on what's going on with Hazel than there is necessarily with Barbie. But then Barbie, falls asleep. She has her own dream, and then she finally finds her way to the land, right? And at the end of this issue, that's what we're dealing with. Like, Barbie's coming in. She's the princess. She's remembering everybody. She's like, let's get this shit on the road. And she is ready to go and do what needs to be done and go on her own hero's journey, which I think is really fascinating, and coming in and bringing hope to these, to these characters, Prinadoo, Luz, and Wilkinson, right? Yeah. So they're all depressed and like all hope is lost and everything sucks and it's all stupid poops, and then she comes in and she's like, let's get this show on the road. We are not giving up. We are doing this thing, which I really, really love. One of the things that I also really kind of love about Barbie, and I don't know if this is deliberate, but it feels like it. Like, I used to have a illustrated Alice in Wonderland when I was a kid, and looking at Barbie, especially when she ends up in the land and when she's in transition from her dream into the land, she feels like Alice in Wonderland. She looks like Alice in Wonderland. She's dressed very similarly, and it's just like it's almost a similar illustration style. And I don't know if this is something that we should have put in Lucien's library, because it's just something that occurred to me now as we were talking about it. I'm wondering if that was deliberate.
I just remember, this is one of those rare situations where I actually remember the script description of Barbie in that first, princessy gown. And I remember that it was a deliberate, I hope I remember, Neil, if I'm wrong, you'll let me know.
I love the text that we get from Neil after every episode, right?
My memory is that there was a deliberate choice not to make her gown a historical gown. Very often, there'll be some comment about this is a Victorian gown, or this is a Georgian gown, or a Regency gown, or whatever. This was very deliberately a kind of child's fantasy of a princess gown.
I love it.
And so it wasn't meant to be historical. I don't know about the Alice in Wonderland. I actually was having this, I don't know if this is related or not, but I was thinking about how much this is a breakup story. And, when, let me think. So when I was first involved as assistant editor on this, I was engaged and then married. So this was right around the beginning of my marriage. And in recent years, I have amicably separated. And I've been thinking about how this is very much a breakup story of Barbie's, because, she has misplaced key elements of herself during the time of her marriage. And so she is also... It's not just about her having to reinvent herself. It's about her having lost touch with her truest self in a way. Here is Wanda, who is in touch with her truest self, and Barbie is searching for this piece of herself that she has lost.
I love that. I love that read, because that is true. And like, when you think about the relationship being a third entity, and then here we have from Hazel's dream, that third entity eating everything, right? And then Barbie's experience is sort of reflecting that a bit in her coming to this land to fulfill this quest, and in that process finding herself. I love that.
That is what makes her more intrinsically interesting to me than Rose. Rose is very young, and I didn't have that same sense of, I think she wasn't fully formed in the way some of us are not
right.
At earlier stages. Whereas Barbie had a richer sense of self. And, as happens to so many people, she, parts of her atrophied or were cut off from the main source. Right. And it's funny because her truest self was... I'm trying to look for the right language here. Her truest self emerges and emerged in this scary, which is a cut off part of the dreaming.
Oh my God.
So this is a part of the Sandman and the part of the dreaming that's sort of been separated from the rest of the kingdom.
What a brilliant read. I love working with you. All right, well, that's a good time for us to break into. We're going to take that moment to break off, and we'll be back in a minute with Lucien's Library. All right, so here we are in Lucien's Library. We look behind the scenes. There may be spoilers in Lucien's Library. We try to save them for this section if we have them, so just be warned if you have not read everything. You may want to skip ahead or save this for later. All right, so Alisa, I think that there is much more discussion to be had around Thessaly, who does seem to be like a complex sort of element in this story. So what can you tell me?
Okay. So the interesting thing about this revelation, that's not a revelation about Thessaly, is that I just was on Facebook and tuned into a discussion in which my name was mentioned by Peter Hogan, the author of Resident Alien. And so what Peter was saying was that this is slightly unrelated, but he had worked on I think it was a mini series called Marquee Moon. And it was, he said, Alisa asked me to do a bit on werewolves. Neil asked me to do something punk. I combined them. It was Marquee Moon. And then it just never came to be. And I thought, oh, crap, I can't remember why, what was my involvement with that. And it turns out that this got... it's one of the things that I couldn't see to its fruition because I then left. That was when I went freelance. But it reminded me about how many times I had been invited to and then proceeded to pitch for monthly series. And I've never had a monthly series. So I will tell you that one of those pitches was around 2010, I think, maybe, or 2011. And it was an ongoing Thessaly series. Ooh. So not only was I roundly refused, but I had gotten Neil's help in crafting this. And so Neil and I sat down. He talked to me in depth about how he saw Thessaly's character. We hashed over some storylines. Oh my God, I did a whole, major storylines for a year with standalone shorts in case an artist needed to, catch his or her breath and someone else would do a fill-in, and then a rough idea for the second year. And it never came to be. So there you go. So I will later on, I'll maybe drop in little bits of the Thessaly series that never was.
I love that idea. So what made you want to write about Thessaly?
I just saw her as such a fascinating and John Constantine-like character. I mean, the joy of writing someone who is, somewhere in that gray area between anti-hero and has moments where you approve and like what they're doing, and other moments where, you just have a guilty delight in their competence, even as they're being, a bitch or a bastard.
Yeah, I mean, look at, I was just watching House last night with my husband, who has this, there's a couple of episodes that he was like, oh my God, you got to see this, And it's so fascinating how House is incredibly complex character who is mostly, damaged goods, who is mostly a bad guy who occasionally does good things in similar to the way that a broken clock is right twice a day, and I find that really interesting, and allowing these characters to be in those shades of gray, I think is one of the things we've had, like I was talking about earlier, is this, we, I think as a culture, are really deeply wanting to be able to simplify not just fictional characters, but each other into these are good people and these are bad people, when we are all shades of gray people, because that is just how people are made, you know? And I know that the conversation has come up about Thessaly being a TERF. I haven't gotten to that part of the story yet. But one of the things that...
We should define TERF.
Oh, right.
I just realized we should define
trans-exclusionary radical feminists. So it is... people who are transphobes, essentially. But especially this specific brand of transphobe comes from women who would maybe otherwise be a feminist, right? Except that they will be a feminist up to the point where the women that they are defending are trans. And it's similar to the white feminism where, you know, we will be super feminist until there are women of color involved, and then we will, you know, beat them down. And it's something that there's a lot of internal work to be done for feminists all along that spectrum. But when it comes down to it, the idea of Thessaly being a TERF as some kind of criticism of the story itself, I feel is where we're going wrong. Now, again, I haven't read it, but I don't think that based on what I've read so far in this series, that the text itself is rubber stamping any of that. They're just saying this is who she is, and there are people like this in the world, J.K. Rowling. So we need to learn how to deal with that. And a lot of the ways we learn how to deal with things and think about things and ask these questions is through our fiction. So what can happen, though, is that people will take one panel out of context from the whole thing and be like, Neil Gaiman is pushing TERF ideology, or whatever it was that people said on Twitter. I took a glance at it and was like, this is ridiculous. But I think that the ability to look at that and talk about it and see that behavior as part of a whole that is that character. And as long as the text isn't rubber stamping and saying that's okay, and similar to how we were talking about how abortion was treated by text as something that we like to have on the books, but our characters won't have one because, and that is an innate judgment of having an abortion in itself by not allowing our quote unquote heroic characters to ever have one and not be riddled with regret and angst.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so I'm having like so many thoughts. Let me see if I can say them without tangling myself into a skein. But okay, when we polarize things utterly, you are either for this or against this. You also make it impossible to talk with any nuance about anything. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking, this is slightly unrelated, but I was thinking about the term bitch. Yeah. Because I have a little bitch. I have a little female puppy. Well, she's now between teenager and teenager. Yeah. She's about 8.5, 9 months. And I got to take her to a group of all her siblings and some other Icelandics from other Icelandic. She's an Icelandic sheepdog. Yeah. She looks like a cross between Fox and Farrah Fawcett in her prime. She's just beautiful. They're all beautiful. But what was interesting is a lot of them were female, and there were all these fights that kept breaking out. A lot of these puppies had not yet been spayed, and so they were having their hormones. And my friend who has Gilda's my puppy, her older sister, just shook her head and said, God, this never happened when we had male Icelandics. They're just fighting. And I realized in that moment, this whole thing, why did bitch become such an insult that people level at people? And I do think it's because, for better and for worse, that female dogs who are neutered have some ups and downs with their hormones. Sure. And I was thinking how, I mean, and again, I don't want to dissuade anyone from having a female dog. I love my Gilda. She is amazing. But she certainly, I can see how there's a little hormonal up and down there.
Well, everybody has hormones. I mean, we talk about like women with their hormones as though
yes.
men don't have hormones. Testosterone is a fucking hormone, and we have testosterone poisoning examples all over the universe. So yes, there are ways in which, and that's the thing, like we can't have the conversation about the ways in which those hormones may be real, because those hormones and that accusation has been used to minimize and
against us. Exactly.
Yeah, so it becomes a difficult conversation to have.
And again, my dogs may not be typical, but my male dog in his adolescent hormones was just about food and frottage. And whereas Gilda gets very irritable at him. And so I do, and again, you know, everyone's a bit different, but it just strikes me that when we take out the polarizing arguments, we are allowing nuance back in.
Yes.
And we can know where something perhaps originated as a slur of bitch without going all the way into it. So anyway, I'm sorry. And I am a work in progress. I am at a Whitney. If anybody, wants to continue.
If anybody wants to argue with me, right?
Please do. And I am sure that there are unspayed female dogs who are perfectly lovely. And I am not saying that.
Right. But that's the thing. Like,
females are particularly bitchy.
You feel like you're expected to speak for every instance. And that's why we can't have conversation with nuance. But I mean, the thing is that like the wide reactions that have come into this space come from harm that has been continually done without accountability for so many years. And we are not certain how to achieve accountability. We are really stuck in this space of not understanding what accountability looks like because we haven't had it, modeled for us in our public spheres. And now that more people have access to be able to speak, people who have been deeply harmed by a lot of the bullshit that has gone on now, are looking for something that says these are the safe people, these are the not safe people, these are the good people, these are the not good people. Our brains like to simplify things because humanity is so freaking complex. It's very difficult to handle. So like I do have empathy for the inclination that just wants things to be simplified so that I can, I, as somebody from any particular, group or identity, can go into the world safely, right? I think that's where the source of a lot of this stuff comes from, for which I have great empathy. But I do think that we are at a point where we are growing through that and learning how to make a space for nuance while holding people accountable, while being interested in prevention of further harm as opposed to punishment and pillaring and torches and pitchforks. We are learning as a society how to navigate that space. And I am a person who tries to have deep hope that we will get through this and we will find a place where we can actually make space for the nuance. But until people who are doing harm are held accountable, this kind of thing is going to continue to happen until that harm stops, until the harm itself stops being something that we accept and promote.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we have this, but I think that in our characters, and especially talking about Thessaly specifically, we need to allow for characters to be written who are doing harm. Maybe they don't know it. Maybe they don't care, whatever. But those are discussions that we need to be able to have. And so when everybody in a story has to be absolutely perfect, the story completely falls down because it ceases to become real about real human experience. But also, it's about what the text says is okay and what it doesn't. And that's what we need to be looking at critically, not whether somebody expresses these things in the first place, because people do it. That's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I also realized that I forgot to mention something that I should just touch on, which is the way that we see Foxglove's breasts.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love that we see Foxglove's breasts. She is not sexualized. I think this is the first time we're really seeing female breasts.
Well, we saw Rose,
and I think,
in the series earlier.
Did we see she was kind of...
Yeah.
We had some breasts?
We had some boob action in Rose. I remember that, yeah.
I don't remember it being as clear,
yeah.
but maybe I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. And I I think this was before Vertigo was actually Vertigo. I think we did get the mature readers label on it, or that would not have been possible.
Right.
But I do know, I mean, we certainly got a lot of blowback for nipples. I remember Curtis King, the covers editor, constantly saying, "You Vertigo people are always going for nipples." And of course, we have such a double standard about male and female nipples. I mean, imagine if we had 6 of them.
Well, I find that interesting because I do love that we are able to see the breasts and we're not sexualizing that. That is huge. I think that is one of the things.
Actually, they're kind of small, but very pretty.
They're lovely breasts, right? But they're not being used as sexual. We're just allowing a female body to have the attributes of a female body without it being blanketed in male gaze bullshit, right? And I think that is also really nice. And when you think back to all of this stuff that we're talking about happening, in early 90s, right? Like that was a time where we weren't. So I really appreciate the ways in which this story and the ways in which it's representative of so many things that we're like as a culture just learning now, but which the text is saying, yeah, they're breasts, get over it. Like that's not what we're talking about, but they do exist. And as much as when we see breasts, they tend to be male gazy. It is like the feminine shame that keeps everything covered up all the time. So the idea that we have Foxglove here having an experience in which we don't have her covered up to the neck and that makes her good, and then see the breasts and that makes her bad, and we're not polarizing the morality of that experience. It is just the reality of how that is. I like that. I think the casual breasts without it being a male gaze banquet is awesome. I all for it. I think it's fabulous. One of the questions that I have to ask you is that earlier I was talking about how I feel in this series that like I'm being pulled along on a story that we know where we're going, that the plan is in place, and that it feels very confident, and it's not like really running off into too many tangents or whatever. I feel like the confidence of the story building, and I'm curious, did Neil plot this stuff out like ahead of time before everything and know what was going to happen, or was he just laying track down as the train was coming and figuring it out as he went? Do you remember that?
I don't think I ever asked him that, because when someone is writing in real time, it seems like such a dangerous question to ask. It's like someone's on a tightrope and you don't want to ask,
you're like, what's the tightrope
are you operating with or without a net? Have you practiced this? So I never asked that question. I just thought, it felt like too dangerous a question to ask at the time. Neil has said that of all the storylines, this perhaps came out the most the way he had intended. He really felt it was successful. And I think all writers know that feeling of you had a thing in your head and it turned out that way. My guess about Neil, and I will double check, or I'm sure he'll let me know or let us know, is that he is what I call a plotzer. Not quite a pantser, not quite a plotter, but someone who has the shape of the thing in his head and is willing to do discovery as well as it comes along. He's, I know Suzanne Brockman and other writers work from very detailed outlines. To my knowledge, that is not a way Neil has ever operated. But again, he had a lot of internalized structures from being such a voracious reader for so long.
And then that stuff will come to you naturally, And when I first started writing, I wrote my first book without like really knowing anything. I just did it purely on instinct. And then that was what set me off to like 20 years of studying and trying to understand story. That's what made How Story Works a thing, because I just needed to know how it was all working, and I couldn't trust my inner sense of story, which some writers are really super able to do. But yeah, I feel the confidence and the connection to the story in the writing.
Yes. And I mean, with exceptions, but I think often writers, dancers, actors, anyone for whom process comes very intuitively has a greater challenge to teach it. Because, it's like being a native speaker of a language, which everyone extols. But really, does the native speaker know all the areas in which a foreign, language student is going to struggle? I guess you learn it.
Yeah, I was very afraid.
In English, the present progressive just always screws people up.
But I was very afraid when I first started learning about stories to do it, because I was afraid that it would break whatever my magic was. And it was I was writing the Lucy March stories that I wrote for St. Martin's Press in the 2015 era, that around then. And I was like, that was when I was really getting a handle on all of the story stuff. And the last 2 books of that, I think, are 2 of the best books that I've written of that series. So it is one of those things, but it is very scary, because there was a period where I felt like I was deconstructing everything that had gotten me where I was in my writing, and that if I looked at it too hard, it would all disintegrate. And it ends up holding up, but I've definitely been through a process, and, I haven't written a book since 2015. So there you go. Working on it now, going back into that coal mine now. But it's a lot.
So I just want to say that I think when it comes to creating story, the spirit of analyzing how things are done runs counter to what needs to happen.
It does. That's the thing, is that you have to forget everything you know about story until you're in revision. And that is a really difficult thing to do. Or at least not let it change the way it's really hard to forget what you know, but not let it overly influence where you're going in the early stages,
Oh, and here's the thing Neil used to do, and I think it's such a good thing. Writers should do it more often. He would read me his favorite part of the script he just written.
I love that.
He'd say, do you know what part I really like? And I thought, allowing yourself to say, this is what I like about what I just wrote. Let me celebrate it. I think, that is, I really don't know that was ever modeled for me by anyone else. And I love doing it now, saying, I just wrote something and it made me happy.
And it's my favorite part. Yeah, that's a huge thing. Anybody who follows How Story Works or follows me on TikTok knows that I talk about what's your favorite part all the time as being absolutely essential to a writer's process. Knowing what the magic is and protecting that at all costs, even if it means you have to bend the craft around it, is absolutely essential. So anybody who wants to learn more about that can go to the How Story Works podcast or buy How Story Works, my book, on Amazon. But also there's some things coming up, I think, that we want to promote for you, Lisa. What are you up to?
Well, I am going to be in conversation with Neil for an evening with Neil Gaiman at the Woodstock Book Fest on April 1st. And there are tickets available for that and other wonderful events. I'm just really excited, thrilled, little nervous to be doing this. When I told some, close friends and family about this on April 1st, they said, wait, is this an April Fool's? So this is not an April Fool's.
It's just on April Fool's. Yeah, and that is right where I grew up. Woodstock is not very far from where I grew up. I love that area, and I wanted to come out and see you, but as it turns out, I'm going to be moving again soon, so I can't do it. I wish I could. I would love to come see you, talk to you.
Hate
Neil.
me.
I love you so much that I would actually consider going even in the middle of a move. That's how much I love you. But talking about our favorite things, let's go to our favorite art, the favorite page. What was your favorite page from this?
Oh, Wilkinson, the grizzled old resistance fighter. Greeting, Barbie. I love Wilkinson. I part of me loved Martin Ten Burns, although we didn't get to see him that long. But Wilkinson, you grizzled old rat. I feel so much
Wilkinson's my dude. I love Wilkinson and this whole thing. I love the page where Barbie finally returns to the land. We have that middle panel where the speech bubbles are sort of curling around her and moving her into the adventure, which I absolutely love. And once again, I have to say, I know I say this a lot, but the ability of the artist to bring that kineticism, into this. And let's nod to Sean McManus. We did a whole Dave McKean love fest earlier in the thing, and I was like, I haven't said how much I am absolutely loving the way Sean McManus is pulling all of this stuff together in the artwork. I think it's fabulous.
So great, so tight. I do love the artwork. I think for a lot of people, this wasn't the broody goth look that they had gotten before in Season of Mists. but it's just, if you let it be the thing that it is so delicious and so well executed.
Absolutely love it. And I love that there's a different feel visually, you know, that the artists come in and they put their own stamp on things. I think that's part of the joy of it.
Oh my God. And I remember the boards, like, you know, I can't remember the technique that Sean had used to create snow, but it was textural on the page with the black of the ink, and it was just, I'm making motions with my hands, everybody, to show the texture. So just, you know, it's so funny. I think the problem with a podcast is that I talk so much with my hands, and I feel like half of my meaning cannot be construed if you can't see my hands waving all around.
I think people can give it up. You're pretty good at explaining the concepts behind what you're thinking. It's just the hand motions give a little extra something for me, and I do appreciate that. All right, so what's your favorite part of the story?
Oh, you know, I just Thessaly calmly killing that psychic bird. It's the calm matter-of-factness. So I was on a kibbutz in Israel in, I was going to say 1981. And there was a young woman called Una, who was also like 16, 17. And a rat ran into her cabin, and I said, "Oh my God, Una, what did you do when the rat ran in?" She said, "Oh, I killed it." You know, it was this very matter of fact, and she made this little like neck snapping thing. I'm like, this woman just reached with her bare hand and just like and Thessaly's matter of fact, super efficient killing of that evil bird just filled me with delight. Hannibal Lecter
It
delight.
is a little Hannibal Lecter. It's very neat, and it really got my attention. I have a very similar moment. It's a Thessaly moment that is my favorite part, and it's when she's going up to George with the knife behind her back. Like, she is not fucking around. Like, George is a scary dude in this context, even if you don't know about the birds. Like, there's something about George that you just like keep your distance, you know. And then she gets the bird, she kills it, then she gets out of bed and she puts on her glasses and she's like, I'm gonna kill this guy, and just has the knife behind her back as she goes up to visit her neighbor. Like, there's something about that is so intriguing and so interesting, and I absolutely love that little detail.
In bunny slippers. Yes. In little, you'll see. If you enjoyed this discussion and would like to join in, Patreon supporters can chat with us and each other through our Patreon Discord channel.
To find out how you can support Chipperish Media, visit patreon.com/Chipperish. Other ways to show your support: write a great review on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends about the show, or use new Wonderwool, now in cinnamon, fresh mint, and new salsa flavors.
This episode of Endless was edited by Chipperish content editor Jack Cram. Jack, well, you took your time, didn't you? Thanks so much for joining us today. Since both Lani and I have tight schedules and must fight the forces of the cuckoo, we will be moving Endless to an every other week schedule. This episode will go up on February 14th, 2023, when some of you have romantic plans and I have a hot date in traffic court. You can expect us to be back talking about the next issue of A Game of You on February 28th, 2023. We'll be back next time with Bad Moon Rising, Issue 3 of Sandman Volume 5, A Game of You. Until then, you're a nasty little thing, aren't you?